Light is the raw material of photography, and while from a technical side, it's the quantity of light, the amount of light that enters the camera through the decisions that we make with shutter speed, with aperture and through ISO. Well, that defines the exposure. What I want to talk about is the quality of light, which is what gives the image its actual essence. And for this video, what I'm going to do is to break that down into three separate groups. I'm going to be talking about golden light, I'm going to be talking about blue light, and I'm going to be talking about flat light. Now, golden light is the kind of light that we get in the hours immediately after sunrise or immediately before sunset, when the sun's really low in the sky, and because it's low and over the horizon, the sunlight, the actual light from the sun, has to pass through a lot more atmosphere before it reaches us. And in its journey through the atmosphere, it picks up a lot more dust and particles and things like that, which gives that kind of light a lovely orange glow. And the fact that the sun is so low in the sky, what it means is any textures in rocks and things like that are really going to be picked up and highlighted and really shown up in the kind of image that we're going to be making. And then we've got blue light, which is immediately out when the sun's just below the horizon. So it's in the hours immediately before sunrise or the hours immediately after sunset. Now at this time of day, because there's no direct light in the sky, there's a lot less contrast. But what we do have is indirect light. As the sun, which is now below the horizon, the light is bouncing off the atmosphere around us, so from the sky, from the clouds, and basically giving us a much more even light and a much bluer light throughout the scene. And then we've got flat light, which is basically what I'm going to be defined by in times during the middle of the day when the sun's in the sky, but we can't see it because the weather is really overcast, there's lots of thick cloud, or because maybe we're in a place like in a forest or something like that below the canopy where the light doesn't penetrate. And each of these three different kinds of light calls for a slightly different approach, and different things work better depending on what the light's like and what kind of subject we're going to be photographing. So let's have a look at some examples of images taken in the golden hour. Now, one of the defining characteristics of this kind of light in the golden hour is because the sun is so low and close to the horizon, the light is incredibly directional, sweeping across the landscape, creating lots of patches of light and shadow, and it works particularly well when the whole scene is side lit, and that is really, really nice when you're shooting in rural landscapes with lots of hills and texture. As you can see, this is an image taken in Tuscany, and what we've got here is the sun sort of swoops across the horizon from the left side of the image. It's really creating lots of drama. There's lots of patches of shadow and lots of patches of light. And one of the great things about shooting these kind of scenes, these kind of rural scenes, is that it really does bring out the most in grass and foliage and things like that. You can see here there's a really beautiful warm glow of light, but on the other side of the hill there's lots of shadow here. So this kind of texture, this contrast between light and shadow, parts of the scene lit by the low sun and other parts left unlit, it gives a lot of depth and a lot more drama and impact to the image. Let's have a look at another example. This is a bit more of an extreme example of the sun being incredibly low. This is very high up at about 4,000 meters on the Bolivian Altiplano on a salt lake, and because we were so high, because there was nothing on the western horizon, the light from the sun was streaming almost completely horizontally across this lake. So you can see here what these are ridges caused by the different plates of salt pressing together and pushing bits of salt up a few centimeters above the flat surface of the lake. So because the sun is so low, whole patches of the lake are falling into shadow here, not touched by the sun, because they're being cast, the light hitting these really low lines of salt is not getting through onto the rest of the lake. So the sun, you can see the sun here is just kind of catching the tops of these lines of salt, and because it's so warm and because it's the sun is coming through, the light's coming through so much atmosphere, you get this incredibly warm golden glow here that sort of creates this really weird image of where it looks like almost liquid fire flowing across the lake. But it's not. At any other time of day, you'd see that this is a uniform color. It's just the interaction with the really low sunlight and the golden hour that's creating this kind of illusion. Now, there are scenes that when you go past at any other time of day, they can appear really flat and uninspiring. But the golden hour and the low light really creates a completely different scene, like this scene of a tree in Tuscany. Now, it's just a tree in the middle of fields, but because of the low light casting, creating these different levels of shadow and these different patches of light and really picking out the tree here, it makes the whole scene seem incredibly different and much more photogenic. Here's another example, again in Tuscany. Now the low light is really just picking out the textures here, creating these shadows, creating this depth, creating a lot more contrast. Now I shot this scene, this is the same scene just a few minutes later after the sun's gone below the horizon. And while it's a fantastic sunset and a lovely sky, the whole of the foreground just looks a lot flatter here. There's no texture, there's no depth, it's just a massive green. And what really makes this scene work is just that contrast between the light and shadow and just the sun, the low light of the sun just picking out these trees here and giving them this lovely warm orange glow. Now it can also work fantastically well in the mountains. Now one of the things about being in mountains is because the horizon is so jagged, what you find is that the sun will illuminate parts of the landscape, but other parts of the landscape are hidden by the mountains, creating lots of patches of shadow. And this is particularly evident here. You can see this is a scene from the Dolomites. And again, the depth is created here by the interplay of the light and the shadow. And that's also helped by the fact that there's quite a lot of clouds in the sky, because clouds have a similar effect in the golden hour. They put some parts of the scene is lit and other parts are hidden in shadow by the clouds. And again, it's the golden hour, so you can see the parts of the scene that are lit, like here or here in the foreground. They're lit in a particularly beautiful warm light, which just gives the whole scene a much more appealing look. This is an example from Norway. It's from Tuscany beach. Now you can see that the whole of the foreground here is dropped into shadow because of a great big mountain that's off to the left of me. But the sun's still a little bit above the horizon, as you can see here on this rock at the back. The sun's just above the horizon. The light's really low, coming across the sea and just picking out this peak in really warm golden red light. And that color is only there during the golden hour because the sun is having to pass through so much atmosphere, and it really warms up the light. And also you can see, because of the clouds on the horizon, we've got this patch of shadow on the top of the peak, which again, it gives the whole scene a lot more depth and a lot more drama. Now an extreme example of that is here again, and it's another shot taken from Bolivia. We were very high up. Now at any other time of day, this was actually quite a flat scene. The mountain's actually very beautiful and impressive, but the whole of the brush in front of us was actually quite flat and brown and grey and not particularly interesting. But just for a few minutes, just before the sun dropped below the horizon, what happened was there was a lot of cloud in the sky, which left a small gap. So there's a gap just above the horizon, and as the sun passed through that gap, it was below the line of the clouds, but above the horizon. So the sun is streaming horizontally across the landscape and giving it this incredibly beautiful warm golden glow that only happened at this time of day. And the parts of the cloud that are scattering the sky are dropping other parts of the mountain here. They're dropping it into shadow, letting other parts be illuminated, which gives the whole image a lot more depth and a lot more drama. The golden hour is just a fantastic time to shoot mountains. This is another example. The sun had just risen here, so what's happening is a few minutes before, the whole scene was blue. The light was really, really blue. But just as the sun comes above the horizon, what it does is it just paints the peaks here. You can see just here and just over here. It's just painting these peaks with the first golden light of the day, and it's just warming up the light on those peaks, turning the snow a little bit pink, which complements with the pink in the sky, but contrasts with all the blue in the rest of the scene in the foreground, where the light hasn't yet fallen. And this is another exactly the same thing. Now I shot this from the blue hour right through to the golden hour. In the blue hour, the scene was a lot flatter, but just as the sun came up off to the left side of the picture, what happens here is these peaks painted and hit with this really beautiful side light just as the sun comes up, and it's a really warm light as the sun passes through, as the light passes through, so much atmosphere, and it really just makes the whole scene just that little bit more appealing. Now when you find yourself out on the coast, what I actually find is doing long exposures in the golden hour, for me personally, it doesn't work. Doing long exposures of 30 seconds or a minute, it is possible if you've got a really thick ND filter, but for me it looks quite unnatural when you have a really beautifully side-lit scene. And in those kind of scenes, when I'm shooting water, I'll much prefer to use slightly faster exposures of about a quarter of a second or half a second to show the movement of the water. And what I'll do is I'll contrast this with the same scene taken in the blue hour about 50 minutes later with a much longer exposure. But for me, when you're shooting in the golden hour, when you're shooting near the ocean, quarter of a second, half a second, 1 second, depending on how strong the light is, works much better. And in these kind of scenes, when you're shooting, and you can see here the sun, it's technically side lighting because the sun's coming in from the side. I'm shooting really wide here, so I wouldn't call it backlit, but you do have to be particularly careful because you can get a lot of flare as the light sort of interacts with the front element, with the different elements in the front of the lens. So you should be looking for something, if not a lens hood, then you can kind of move your you can move your hand around the side of the frame and just try to put a little bit of shadow, cast a shadow on the front of the lens, just to try to avoid getting any lens flare on. So again, this scene is side lit. There's another example. It's exactly the same thing. The light's coming in from the side. So it's this really warm golden light that's hitting this peak, and a shutter time of about a second here works particularly well. Now again, a little bit later, and I'll show this later on in the video, when the sun had gone down and we were no longer in the golden hour, we'd moved into the blue hour, much longer exposures work much better. This is a rare example of being able to shoot directly into the light during the golden hour. We'd actually been shooting from slightly to the side to try to keep the light out of the frame, because when you shoot into the sun, when the sun's really low onto the horizon, what you're going to do is lose lots of highlights. Now there are different ways around this. You can try using filters, but shooting directly into the sun, even with a thick 3-stop graduated neutral density filter, you're still going to use highlights. You can also try shooting multiple exposures, which is a technique that also works quite well. But if you're shooting a slightly longer exposure, it can be a bit difficult because it's possible that the water or the clouds have moved between one exposure and the other. So I like to try to do the whole thing in one shot if possible. Now, when you've got really thick cloud on the horizon, that does give you the opportunity, as in the golden hour, as the sun just moves behind the low-lying cloud on the horizon. As you can see here, this is the sunrise, and the sun rose up and kind of went behind these clouds on the horizon. What this gave me the opportunity to shoot directly into the sun in one frame without losing highlights. Now, another danger of losing highlights when you're shooting at this time of the day is not just in the sky, but also in the reflections in the water. So you can use a filter in the sky, which I'm using here, but you can still start to lose detail in the water. Now, I had to be very careful. You can see just here where it was starting to get much brighter, and there's a possibility of that part of the image burning out and losing detail, which just looks very ugly, and it's quite hard to pull it back in post-processing. But when the sun hides behind a cloud, it takes just that little bit of edge off the incredibly bright light. So it's one of the few instances during the golden hour when it's possible to shoot directly into the sun. Now here's an image taken in the Sahara. Again, I'm looking directly into the sun here because I'm shooting so wide, but even though I'm looking into the sun, you can still see that there's quite a lot of side light as parts of the dunes are lit by the sun and other parts of the dunes are left dropping into the shadow. And it's created a lot of texture, a lot of depth in this scene. And the reason why I was able to shoot into the sun here is because there was a sandstorm rolling in from the horizon. So much cloud that a lot of the sun was obscured. And even though I'm still not crazy about this image, the sun is a little bit too bright, and the whole distribution of the highlights through the atmosphere was really quite strange. What it does is it gives an example of how early morning sun can really pick out the different kind of textures, the different shape, and give so much more depth to an image. Now let's take a look at some examples of images taken in the blue hour. Now everything changes in the blue hour. The sun disappears below the horizon and takes with it a lot of the contrast, where before we had that really low directional light cutting across the horizon, giving you lots of patches of light and shadow. As soon as the sun goes below the horizon, that's completely gone. But what you find is that the sun, as it's below the horizon, it's bouncing up and reflecting light from the atmosphere across the whole of the scene, creating a much more evenly lit scene. So while you do lose a lot of the contrast, what you do get is a lot of warm color, particularly in the sky. Now, generally, as I was saying, I find that these kind of rural scenes like in Tuscany work better in the golden hour. If you remember, we looked at this one earlier. This is from exactly the same spot, taken about 50 minutes later after the sun had come up. This is slightly earlier, just in the blue hour before the sunrise. And usually these kind of scenes, I really do feel that they work better in the golden hour than the blue hour, because it's the contrast that really gives a lot of the depth. But because of the mist here, there's an extra element in the scene that sort of helps the depth and gives us a little bit of compression because I'm shooting with a telephoto. But we do lose the contrast on the landscape. So it gives you a very different interpretation of the scene. Now, another example is this one, which again, this is taken in the Salt Lake in the Altiplano. This is in the golden hour, before the sun's gone below the horizon, and this is in the blue hour. So you can see the sun it's below the horizon, but because this peak is so high, it's still picking up just a little bit of light there. But the whole of the rest of the scene is completely fallen into the shadow, and we're now into the blue hour. The sun's bouncing off the sky and illuminating the whole scene, which has completely changed the color of the foreground. You can see before it was where we had the shadow and the golden light. What we've got now is a much kind of more evenly magenta kind of light. As the sun diffuses, it bounces around off the atmosphere and gives a much more evenly lit scene. Now, this is an example, again, shot just after the sun's gone down. Now, in the golden hour, what happens here is there's probably too much contrast. This is shot in Iceland in the black sand desert in the highlands. And when the light starts to hit this black sand, you get incredibly high contrast, really deep blacks, really bright parts where the sun's reflecting off it. But as the sun goes down, it's really given the whole landscape a lot more even, softer lighting, which works for this particular scene. In the blue hour, you still get there's still a lot of light in the sky. And that ambient light, that indirect light, still gives a lot of color to the scene. We've got another scene from the mountains here. Again, this is about 50 minutes after the sun's gone down. There's no direct light anymore. And while before the scene was actually impossible to shoot because the sky behind was incredibly bright and the peaks in front of here were silhouetted against that kind of light. So the contrast was so strong, and consequently I couldn't get any detail in these peaks, couldn't get any depth, and the whole image didn't work. But as soon as the sun's gone down, we get this much more even light, which means that we can shoot more into the light and still get a lot more of the detail, a lot more of the textures coming out, even though they're not being picked out by that directional light. The much more even light of the blue hour makes the whole scene much softer and work much better. And you can still see that even though the light is no longer direct, the sides of the peaks here and over here are still picking up the indirect light that's bouncing off the clouds and bouncing off the atmosphere back down onto the peaks. This is a similar example taken in Norway. Now the sunrise came up it's almost in the frame here, a little off to the right of the frame. And what it meant was this peak in front of me didn't catch any direct light, and it dropped into shadow a little bit, and the whole scene had a little bit too much of a high contrast. So I found that I preferred shooting this scene in the blue hour without the direct light. Now at another time of year or another time of day when the sun moves around in the sky and is picking out this rock in front of me, then it would probably be great to shoot it in the golden hour. But at this particular time of the year, we were there in very early March, and for sunrise, the scene worked much better in the blue hour with a much more evenly lit scene. And what it also allowed me to do was to drop a neutral density filter onto the front of the camera and create a long exposure and really sort of blur out all the details in the water and blur some of the cloud movement in the sky. Again, this is the scene that I showed earlier. This is shot on the same day. This is in the golden hour. You can see that the sun is just on the horizon here. So I was shooting it with about a half a second exposure to get a lot more drama and movement into the water. But then when the sun goes down and we enter into the blue hour, we can shoot the whole scene in a different way. Now what happened here was I could move around the chapel a little bit and shoot directly into the light. Now I couldn't do that in the golden hour. I'd have the sun in the shot, and the chapel would have been dropped into silhouette. I'd have had lens flare going on everywhere. But because I'm now shooting into the blue hour, because the light is really even, I don't really have to worry about losing highlights. The whole scene is going to be much more evenly lit, and I can just capture a very different mood. And I've been able to use a long exposure rather than the half a second exposure, which really captured the movement of the water here. What I've done here is used a long exposure to blur the water out and just to give the whole scene a different feel. Now, it's not that one image is better than the other, it's just that certain things work in certain kind of lighting conditions. So for me, long exposures really help to capture the mood of the blue hour, and slightly faster exposures work much better in that lovely dynamic light and high contrast scenes that you get in the golden hour. This is another example of the same scene shot in the same day, but in slightly different lights. This is one that I showed you earlier in the golden hour when the sun is still up and in the horizon. It was just before a storm came in, so we got these lovely black clouds, and I was shooting with a 1/2 second or 1 second shutter speed. And then as we got into the blue hour and the sun had gone down about 15 minutes ago, there was still plenty of light in the sky. So there's still plenty of color, but the light now was non-directional. It was much more even. So the whole scene is evenly lit. I didn't have to worry about these rocks in the foreground dropping into shadow because they didn't have the light. They weren't creating a lot of contrast with the sun hitting them. The whole scene is much more evenly lit, and again it creates a much different mood to shoot with a much longer exposure. This is an exposure of about a minute, so you can see that the clouds are really blurred around the rock stack, and the water is much more blurred. And again, it's not an either or, it's just a case of certain things, certain scenes work much better. This scene it's a much moodier scene. It works much better with a long exposure. Shooting it in the golden hour, it's a very different scene. It's much more lively. There's a lot more going on in the sky. So you try to shoot the scene in the way that the light kind of dictates to you. And then just one final shot. This is again taken in Norway, and it's of the Rhine Fjord. This is taken again during the blue hour, and quite often when you're shooting in places with villages or some kind of urban setting, then you'll get that moment when the lights come on, but it's still not dark yet. Now the blue hour is a really narrow period of day, because as soon as the blue hour passes, then it starts to get too dark and you don't get any contrast in the scene. All the color is drained out of the scene. But for just that hour, or maybe a little bit more depending on where you are in the world, what the latitude is, after the sun's gone down, before it actually gets dark, when you're still in the twilight phase, when you're still in the blue hour phase, there's still plenty of color in the sky. And it works particularly nicely when you've got a scene where you've got villages. And you can see here, so even though it's still light, some of the lights are starting to come around the town before it gets dark, and there's still plenty of light and contrast and color in the scene. Finally, let's have a look at some examples of images taken in overcast or really flat light. Now, generally overcast and cloudy weather is considered to be pretty poor for landscape work. Everything looks a lot flatter and washed out, and there's not really any contrast or depth. But flat overcast light can really work well in some particular scenes and locations. For example, it's great for shooting waterfalls when strong light gives too many highlights and shadows in the water. It creates too much contrast and you get these incredibly bright spots which reflect in the sunlight. And this shot is a good example of that, because these waterfalls are actually facing south. It's almost at any other time of day. As the sun's hitting them, it's creating too much contrast, too much light, too many highlights. It's very difficult to shoot. But in an overcast, cloudy day, which is actually really quite common when you're photographing in Iceland, waterfalls really do work much better. Now, another example of that is here. This is another waterfall in Iceland. It's taken right in the middle of the day. Now, I'd have loved to have come here in the golden hour, and I'd have loved to have come here in the blue hour and shot it with lots of color in the sky, but we were here in the middle of the afternoon, and the cloud was really thick and heavy. There's spots of rain coming in, but you could still actually make a scene that worked, because overcast light, again, it's got some characteristics that are quite similar to the blue hour in that you get much more evenly distributed light. So you don't have as much contrast. You don't get the wonderful shadows and highlights that you get in the kind of images that I was showing in the golden hour section. But you do get a much more even light, which works in particular cases. Now here the landscape was incredibly green, and this kind of flat light is really bringing out that color and giving it a kind of subdued effect that really fits with this particular scene and with this particular mood. Now again, I'm not saying that this wouldn't work well in the golden hour and the blue hour, but it actually also works when you've got thick overcast cloud. That kind of light really does help with this kind of scene. It really fits with the mood and the atmosphere that I was trying to get. Another example of that is here. Now this is a really common sunset location in Norway, and again, when we went here we were hoping to have really beautiful colored skies, or some really dramatic sunset light that would pick out this peak, and that was the last light of day in the golden hour, but it never really happened. But on one particular day, we were driving past here right in the middle of the day, but there was lots of cloud in the sky, and the flat light was really sucking almost all of the color out of the landscape. So it created an entirely different effect which worked really well. So what I was trying to do in this particular scene was look for textures and look for ways of enhancing that kind of overcast, flat mood and giving the image depth in different ways, because I didn't have the golden light and those textures and that directional light to play with, and I didn't have the lovely warm colors that you often get in the blue hour. So it was all about making the most of the almost monochromatic scene and looking at textures, trying to keep the image as simple as possible and fit the scene to the particular mood of the lighting that I was getting at that particular time. Now, another example of that is here in Scotland. Now, this is a really famous sunrise location, and it must be fantastic to go up there at sunrise, see the sun come up in the east, and paint these rocks in the Old Man of Storr with a wonderful golden light as the horizontal directional light sweeps across the landscape, and you get all these wonderful textures picked out, and if you're lucky you get lots of color in the sky. Now, I hiked up there for 2 sunrises and I never once saw any light whatsoever. On both of those occasions it was really foggy and misty, but I did also hike up there in the middle of the afternoon to scout the location, and because it is such a wonderfully dramatic location, I decided to take a few shots because we had this really heavy overcast cloud and it was a very high wind, so the clouds were racing across the sky. So what I thought I'd do is just see if I could fit that mood, that really flat even light, that really heavy dramatic sky, fit that into the scene. So even though this was shot in the middle of the day, the scene actually works. I dropped it into black and white because this was taken sometime around March or April. There's nothing really happening in the grass. It was this kind of dirty yellow. Again, in the golden hour, if the sun had been coming in horizontally, that would have actually turned quite golden and would have been a lovely warm texture. But under this light, it really wasn't working. So one technique that really does work when you're shooting in the middle of the day in flat overcast light is to either desaturate the image, as I did in the previous shot that I showed you from Norway, or just to turn the image into full black and white and really work on really sort of try to bring out the textures and bring out the mood of the scene, which really works quite well here in monochromatic light. There's another example of that here, which again, it was really flat, really overcast, nothing particularly happening in the sky. It would have been normally the golden hour, but the cloud was completely obscuring the sun. So what I did was just really focused on the texture, on creating a really long exposure and trying to fit the mood of the scene, the mood of the light to the mood of the scene, and just composing to get lots of texture. Even though I don't have the texture from the directional side light, there's still quite a lot going on in the foreground, and just using that kind of monochromatic blue feel that the overcast light was creating on the scene. Just one final image is this one taken in the Sahara. Now this contrasts with this image that I showed earlier, which has this golden light, this wonderful directional light, which creates a lot of contrast and depth along the sand dunes, whereas this image was taken in the middle of the day under really heavy cloudy conditions. There was no directional light, there was nothing really there to give drama to the scene, there was no point using color. So again, I focused on the texture, I focused on the line and the form, and tried to fit the mood of the scene that I was seeing in front of me into the wet weather that I actually had at the time, and just created this much more abstract image, not worrying about the depth, not worrying about the contrast, just concentrating on the actual line and the shapes within the image. So that's it for this video really. Now, as a landscape photographer, I'm always going to be excited by wonderful dynamic light and colorful skies, but the reality is that we don't get to choose the weather or the light that we have. So particularly one of the things when you're on a photography trip is if you've only got a few days in the location, it can quite often be the case that you don't get that wonderful golden light or that wonderful sunset in the blue hour that you pre-visualized. So one of the things that you need to do is to be able to look at the scene, look at the light that you're getting, and then see how you can fix those two things together. How can you reflect the lighting conditions that you have with the scene that you're looking at, and seeing if you can find ways to create mood. And through practice, we can quickly get a feel for how these things are interacting together, how the light's interacting with the landscape, and consequently, how we can best shoot it and how we can best make use of the light that we've got. Okay, well, that's it for this video. I hope it's been useful, I hope it's been interesting. Once again, if you have any questions, just please drop me a comment. And thanks for watching, and as ever, take care.